Welcome to the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. Your guide is pastor and theologian Dr. John Whitaker, and the heart behind these studies is to help you better understand the text of Scripture so you can more fully live it out. It's all about helping you learn and live the Bible. Here is the book of 3 John.
All right, welcome to our study of 3 John here on the Listener's Commentary. The letter of 3 John is, by word count in Greek, the shortest letter in the New Testament. It's a little under 200 Greek words. And it really is similar in size to most of the known letters we have from the Greco-Roman world, particularly personal notes. And that's really what 3 John is. It's a note between two people. It has two purposes. One is to introduce a fellow by the name of Demetrius to a guy by the name of Gaius. So he's going to introduce Demetrius to Gaius. And the second purpose is to address a question about welcoming fellow Christians who come to town who are teaching the truth. Like 2 John, 3 John is addressed from the elder. And we could wish that the author would have specified a little more clearly who he is, but as we discussed in the backstory to both 1 John and 2 John, the earliest testimony to who this is from the church is that this is John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. And in fact, 3 John has a lot of the same language, some of the same themes as 1 and 2 John. So they're most likely all written by the same person at the same time, dealing with some of the same issues. Now, 3 John is addressed to a specific individual, a man named Gaius. We don't know exactly who this man is. There was a man by this name who was involved with Paul in his ministry in Ephesus. And remember, John is living at Ephesus. That's where he's writing from. So that's an interesting connection. We can read about it in Acts chapter 19 when the riot over Artemis broke out in Ephesus. Gaius and an Aristarchus were dragged into the theater in lieu of not being able to find Paul. So could it be the same man? Could it be the same Gaius? Well, it's possible. And if it is, he's moved from Ephesus to a neighboring town and involved in a church there, and that's why John writes to him. But I think it's more likely it's not the same Gaius that's mentioned in Acts 19. And the reason I say that is because here in this letter, John refers to Gaius as his child, which makes it sound like Gaius is John's son in the faith. That was the standard way to refer to it, just like Paul refers to Timothy as his child. And that would suggest then that Gaius was led to faith in Jesus by John himself. And if so, then obviously it wouldn't be the Gaius that's mentioned in Acts 19. So I tend to think we're dealing with a different Gaius here than that one there. So it is addressed from John, who describes himself as the elder, to a man named Gaius. And Gaius is involved in a church in a neighboring town to the city of Ephesus. And in the church that Gaius is a part of, there's been an issue brewing around the topic of hospitality. That is, around the idea of welcoming brothers and sisters who come to town, especially those who come to town and are traveling for the sake of ministry. We noted in our study of 2 John that John brings up this issue there, where there's something related to that. And perhaps this issue is related to the situation that's been plaguing the churches of Asia that John addresses in 1 and 2 John. We're not sure if that's the reason for the situation here. But Gaius himself has a reputation for practicing such hospitality, for welcoming people who are coming to town, fellow Christians, especially those who are coming to town for the sake of ministry. The Christians that John knows have borne witness to Gaius's love and care and hospitality. And John commends Gaius for that, affirms him that he's doing right by doing that. But in contrast to Gaius, there's a man in the church, wherever Gaius is at, there's a man there named Diotrephes, and he has a different take on all of this. He hasn't welcomed the brothers and sisters. In fact, he's even rejected people that John has sent, John's own representatives that he sent to the church. And John says in this letter that not only that, he's effectively rejected John's message. Now, we don't, again, know the details and exactly why this is the case. Has Diotrephes been influenced by some of the false ideas that John has been combating in 1 John and 2 John, and that's why he's rejected the people John has sent? Is there a personal beef of some sort between John and Diotrephes? We just don't know. But John calls Diotrephes out and tells Gaius that John himself will deal with Diotrephes when he's able to come for a visit. And all of that kind of situation and backstory unfolds fairly quickly in this brief, short, very personal letter addressed to Gaius. So 3 John reads like this: "The elder," that is John himself, "to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth." A couple things to note. Obviously, this is a personal note between one individual to another. And notice how Gaius is described. He's beloved. He's somebody that John dearly loves. He's a dear friend, in other words, of John. In fact, some translations take this word beloved, and that's the way they translate it, to my dear friend Gaius. And then John says, whom I love in the truth. And as we talked about in 2 John, this idea of loving in the truth probably has more than just the idea that I love him genuinely. It's like, I love you in this realm of the truth where we're existing, the truth about Jesus and all that. I love you in the truth about Jesus. Then after that introduction, John gives a kind of a well wish, which was, again, pretty standard in ancient Greco-Roman letters. He writes in verse 2, "Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers." And this is a kind of wish for well-being and a wish for good health. And that was standard in a lot of the letters we have examples of from this time period. So John is simply following the convention of the day in personal notes like this. And he wishes that Gaius might prosper and his soul might prosper. That doesn't mean just get rich. We have this very shallow understanding of prosper in the English language and in our cultural context today. But it meant to like flourish, to thrive, that in all respects you may thrive and be in good health, like physically and spiritually in every way, including your soul, your whole being might thrive and prosper. So he wishes that for him. And then John says in verse 3, "For I was overjoyed when brothers and sisters," that is, people came from the church and testified to your truth. That is, that you're walking in the truth. So some people have come to where John is at, and they've given a good report about Gaius, that he's walking in the truth. He's continuing faithfully to live according to the truth about Jesus. And in view of all the things John wrote in 1 and 2 John and how concerned he was for the churches in the area and that they continue to remain in the truth, John is overjoyed to learn that Gaius is faithfully walking in the truth. And then John says this, and this probably explains why he's so happy for Gaius remaining in the truth. Verse 4, "I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth." And this suggests that Gaius is one of John's children in the faith, somebody that John led to faith. And that's why John's so excited and so happy to hear that Gaius is remaining true. He's remaining faithful. He's living by the truth. He's walking in the paths of truth. And again, notice the emphasis on truth in verses 3 and 4. This is consistent in 1st, 2nd, and here in 3 John. And it is likely due to the fact that there are these issues swirling around where some people have left the truth, but not Gaius. He's faithful to the truth. And then John really gets into the body of the letter in verse 5. He says, "Beloved." And remember, this is addressing Gaius. You could easily hear that as plural, like in some of Paul's letter, but not here. It's singular, and it's referring to Gaius specifically. "Beloved, dear friend, you are acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brothers and sisters, especially when they are strangers." What John is getting at by that language is the practice of Christian hospitality. Some have taught in recent times that hospitality for Christians in the Bible means caring for unbelievers. And they usually base that on the etymology of the word, which literally means stranger lover. That's just not accurate. That's not the way hospitality is described, like here in the New Testament, as well as in the writings of the early church after the time period of the New Testament. What they're getting at is that it refers to hosting and caring for fellow Christians who are traveling through your town. And the reason for that is because of the cultural situation, where there weren't a whole lot of hotels available to you, and most hotels had a pretty seedy reputation. They often were connected with brothels and a lot of immoral type behavior. And as a result of that, hospitality was deeply necessary. And so you would find people that were like-minded to you, of your same sort of social background and same value system, and you would seek them out and stay with them. And Gaius has been doing that. John describes it as accomplishing for the brothers and sisters, especially when they're strangers, people he didn't even know, fellow Christians who have come to town. He's never met them, never heard of them, and he's welcoming them. In fact, verse 6 says, they've testified to your love before the church. They've come back and they've said, hey, when you're traveling, if you go through X town, wherever Gaius is living, look up this guy named Gaius. He is genuinely loving. He showed us great hospitality. He would be happy to host you. And so they have testified to your love before the church. And John even says in the second half of verse 6, you will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. You're doing what's right. You're doing good. When they come, they stay with you. You give them some provisions for the rest of their journey. That's the idea. You send them on a manner worthy of God, that you're providing for them and providing what they need even for the rest of their journey. John then goes on in verse 7 to actually describe who some of these people are, why they're coming to town. For they went out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. In other words, they left wherever they were at, traveling, seemingly for ministry, for the sake of the name. The name refers to Jesus. It was a common early way of referring to Christians and to those who were followers of Jesus. In fact, you see this, for example, in Acts chapter 3 with Peter and appropriately John in the temple. And there's this man who is begging alms, and Peter and John heal him. And this is what is said. On the basis of faith in his name, that is in the name of Jesus, it is the name of Jesus which has strengthened this man. Or a little bit later, after they're arrested for healing this man, kept overnight, they say to the authorities, there's salvation in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven that has been given among mankind by which we must be saved. That's Acts 3:16 and Acts 4:12. And so the name was a common early way of referring to Jesus. And so what John is saying in verse 7 is these people whom Gaius has hosted went out from their own city on behalf of the name of Jesus, serving the name. And they accepted nothing from the Gentiles. They didn't take provisions from unbelievers, so they're counting on provisions and care and hospitality from fellow Christians like Gaius. And so John says in verse 8, therefore, we ought to. Like, it's the right thing to do. We who are faithful to Jesus, we ought to support such people so that we may prove to be fellow workers with the truth. So in hosting them and providing for them and caring for them, Gaius and others like him, they're actually doing what's right. They're supporting people in ministry, and thus they're proving to be fellow workers with the truth about Jesus. John then goes on and says, I wrote something to the church that Gaius is a part of, and perhaps this is 1 John or 2 John, maybe both of them. We're not sure. But he says, I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. This is where we meet this guy named Diotrephes, who is rejecting John and rejecting his message. And we don't know exactly who Diotrephes is. He's apparently an influential Christian in this congregation. The fact that he has enough clout, as we'll see in the following sentences, to actually kick people out of the church suggests that perhaps he's like the patron, the host, that maybe the church meets in his house, because churches were dependent on that. They didn't have their own meeting places. They met in a wealthy person's home who had a large enough home to host people. And so maybe Diotrephes is the host, or at least a leader of some sort, that he has enough clout to do that. So we can piece that together. And Diotrephes, John says, loves to be first. He wants to be the big shot. He wants to be number one. He likes to be in charge, which stands in stark contrast to how Jesus taught us to hold our authority and our influence in his church, right? Jesus taught us that the first shall be last. The greatest shall be the servant of all. Diotrephes needs to learn that lesson, and he hasn't. He wants to get all the attention. He loves to throw his weight around. He likes to be number one. So he rejects what John says, and therefore he rejects even the people that John sends. So John says in verse 10, "For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds." Now, John says, "If I come," here at the close of the letter, he says, I expect to come soon. So he's trying to plan a visit. He's hoping it works out. He doesn't know exactly when it'll be, but he's hoping it's shortly. And when he comes, he says, I'm going to call him out face to face. I'm going to call attention to his deeds and the things he does. And then John highlights 3 deeds that are a problem that Diotrephes is responsible for. This is what John says, which he does. And here's the first deed, unjustly accusing us with malicious words. Notice that, unjustly accusing John and those that John sends out, those that are aligned with John. He accuses us with mean-spirited, harsh, malicious words. Second, John goes on and says, and not satisfied with this, he himself doesn't receive the brothers either. So he's rejecting people, faithful people walking in the truth who have come to town and are looking for hospitality, and Diotrephes rejects them. He won't welcome them. Hospitality protocols require that you receive someone sent by a person with authority. And so here's people that John himself is sending out, and Diotrephes should, by the standards of the day, gladly welcome them, but he doesn't. And so if he's rejecting people John sent out, he's effectively rejecting John himself. So that's the second problem with Diotrephes that John's going to call attention to. And the third, he says, and he forbids those who want to do so and puts them out of the church. Not only does he reject them himself, but anybody like Gaius who wants to do that, he's going to kick them out of the church, not allow them to come to the church gathering that, again, likely meets in his house, or in some way he has enough clout to kick these people out or to force them to stay away from the church. And because John himself teaches the truth, and because his letters pass on the truth, rejecting him and his teachings and the representatives that he sends, rejecting all of that runs the risk of harming the church. And John just can't let that go. So when he comes to town, he's going to call attention to Diotrephes and his deeds. Now then John goes on in verse 11 and says to Gaius, beloved, again addressing Gaius, dear friend, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. John calls Gaius, in other words, to not follow the example of Diotrephes. Just because maybe there's social pressure, because Diotrephes is doing this, because he has clout and influence. No, you're in the right, Gaius, by welcoming people. Continue to do what's good. It's Diotrephes who's out of step with the truth. It's not Gaius who's out of step with the truth. So imitate what is good. Continue to walk in the truth. And that means for Gaius, continue to welcome the representatives from John and anyone else who holds to the truth about Jesus and who comes to town for the sake of the name. The one who does what is good is of God, John says. The one who does what is evil has not seen God. Now, again, you could take that little sentence and just pull it out of its original context and lose some of the specific force of what John is saying. So it's really important that we hear that sentence read in the total context of the letters of John. In other words, this doesn't mean that anyone who does some good things is of God. That's not what John is saying. John clearly doesn't mean that because he's written so much about the importance of living faithfully by the truth about Jesus as Messiah and Son of God. And even in this short letter, he commends Gaius for living according to the truth. So it's in that context that this sentence needs to be read. So what does John mean when he says the one who does what is good is of God, the one who does not or does what is evil is not of God? Well, he means that people like Diotrephes who don't do the good, in this case, the good of welcoming and caring for brothers and sisters bringing the truth, they don't know God. It doesn't matter what they claim or what they say. It doesn't matter if he's the host to a church in his house. He doesn't know God if he's not willing to walk according to the truth and do this good thing of welcoming other truth teachers and truth bringers. And this then leads to kind of the beginning of the conclusion of the letter, where John introduces one of his colleagues, probably the guy carrying the letter, that he wants Gaius to welcome. So look at verse 12. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself, and we testify too, and you know that our testimony is true. Our assumption is that Demetrius would be the letter carrier. He's the one bringing this. He's coming to town, maybe for the sake of the name, maybe for the sake of ministry. He's coming as a representative of John. And John is essentially saying, here's Demetrius, he's got a good reputation. He's a truth teacher. He's a truth bringer. Welcome him. That's the implication of verse 12. Now, it's interesting to note that there is a Demetrius from Ephesus that's mentioned again in Acts chapter 19. And in that story, he's the unbelieving silversmith who actually started the riot over Artemis. Is it possible that this Demetrius that John mentions here, 30 years after that fact or so, is the same man, and now he's become a Christian? Well, yeah, it's possible. But Demetrius was also a fairly common name, and Ephesus is a fairly big city, so it's just as possible that it's another Demetrius. But this Demetrius that's described in verse 12 has received a good testimony. That is, he's received a good recommendation from everyone, that is, from the church itself. And he's received a good recommendation from the truth itself, meaning he has an established reputation of faithfulness to the truth about Jesus and the gospel. And not only that, verse 12 says that we testify, and you know that our testimony is true. So John himself testifies to Demetrius' faithful character. And at that point, John has basically recommended Demetrius to Gaius to host and to welcome so that he could bring some truth to the church there. And with that, then, John signs off the letter. He writes, I had many things to write to you, but I do not want to write to you with pen and ink, similar to 2 John. There's other things I want to say. I really want to address some other issues. I don't really want to write it with pen and paper, but I hope to see you shortly, and we will speak face to face. So again, it sounds like John is planning a visit, and he's hoping to come soon. And so I'm hoping to see you shortly. We can talk more face to face. Peace be with you. Shalom to you. And then he says, the friends greet you, and greet the friends by name. That's an interesting ending to this little letter. We'd almost expect John to say, the brothers and sisters greet you. But it says, the friends. And brothers and sisters is a little bit more common in New Testament letters. My suspicion is, since this is more of a personal note, it's quite possible then that John uses friends to refer to maybe a specific, smaller group of people whom Gaius knows well and whom John knows well. And that's why he says, the friends from me that you know very well greet you, and would you greet my friends that you know well there by name as well? And so instead of writing out all those names, he's probably running out of room on his paper, so would you greet them all by name from me? Now, this is a short personal letter between John, the apostle, and a Christian with a certain measure of influence somewhere, and it's a very, very specific note. So what does that mean for us today? What is its value for us? Let me just wrap up our study of 3 John with a little bit of reflection on its value for us. The first thing that strikes me is this idea of testimony and recommendations, like John gives for Demetrius. That it's important for us to give good testimony and good recommendation for people's genuine faith and their faithfulness to the truth. That's what John does for Demetrius, bringing this letter. You can welcome him in good conscience. You can know that he teaches the truth. And that's important. In the world today, that's important for us to remember. There are people who claim to know God and claim Jesus, but they're not aligned with the truth. And they should not get a good recommendation from us. And then there are people who are faithful followers of Jesus. Maybe they differ on a few things from us, but they're faithful followers of Jesus. They know the gospel. They know the truth about Jesus as Messiah and Son of God. and they should get a good recommendation from us. And that's appropriate, and that's good, and that's right within the church. In fact, John says it's a good thing to do, and he commends Gaius for doing it. That is closely related to the main heart of this letter, and that is the issue of hospitality. Our world is very different from their world. We have plenty of hotels and Airbnbs and other ways to host people that they did not have access to. And so maybe our hospitality needs and our hospitality conventions look different. But the principle of the thing is this: extending care and love for faithful servants of Christ is a core value in the new family of Jesus. That's really important. Extending care and love for faithful servants of Christ is a core value in the new family of Jesus. And so as churches, men and women who have gone out for the sake of the name, who are faithful servants of Jesus, who get a good recommendation according to the truth and according to the traditions of the church, right? Who know Jesus and the Son of God, who are in step with orthodoxy, men and women like that. Well, it's right and it's a good thing to do to extend care and love and provision for faithful servants of Jesus. The way we do it might look different from the way they did it, but that's still a key value as followers of Jesus today. All right, thanks for tuning into this study of the letter of 3 John on the Listener's Commentary. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity and support of dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support, for making this ministry possible. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and you can sign up for a one-time gift right there, or you can click a little box that says Make This Monthly. Got to do that before you go any further. After you put in the dollar amount, you got to click that little box if you want to make it monthly, and you can set up a monthly donation right there. Thanks a ton for your support.